Hey folks, hope you're doing well today. I'm going to do a video today that kind of came at the suggestion of the crew who said, Randy, we get all these questions about what type of camp we use when we're elk hunting. Why don't you scratch down some notes and let's do a video on that. Throw in a bunch of B-roll that show people what and when and why we use whatever camp it is we decide on. So I got my notes here, and I've come to realize that one of the biggest decisions that come about in any elk hunt is what type of camp are we going to have? And it comes down to two options. Either a backcountry camp where we put it on our back or on a llama and we go way back there, or we do a base camp and we hunt out of that base camp. Now, each of them are going to have their own pros and cons. They're going to have reasons when we do it, when we don't do it, why we do it. And I'm going to get into a bunch of this, but you're going to see that it's mostly dependent upon a couple principles. The mobility we need, the risk-reward relationship or the risk-return that we're willing to accept, and the flexibility that we need because certain calendar periods the elk are moving a lot more. So I'm going to start with backcountry camps. Backcountry camps are the highest risk, highest reward proposition out there. And let me explain. So when you decide you're going to go way back in there, 5, 6 miles, 8 miles, you're going to spend at least a day getting in there. And if you get in there and someone's already there, you're spending a day coming back out and maybe another day going into another spot. So there you've lost 2 or 3 days of hunting. Or sometimes you go in there, there's no one there, and you're like, oh, great. And 2 days later, here comes another group of hunters, and they plop down right beside you. And since you're hunting on foot, it's not like you can go 10 miles to the next drainage. So that's what I mean when I talk about high risk, high reward. You're going to invest a lot of time setting that camp up and getting that camp pulled if you either, well, maybe it's a dry hole, right? Your e-scouting says, boy, this is really a great spot, but you get in there, it's like, man, there hasn't been an elk in here for 3 months. Well, guess what? You're going to spend a lot of time pulling camp and going somewhere else. So you can mitigate that risk a little bit if you have stock animals, whether it's llamas, horses, some people use goats. Because if you do have to pack up and move 4 or 5 miles to different drainage, well, that's a lot easier with stock animals than it is on your back. So that's one way you see us mitigate our risk when we're doing backcountry hunts. If you're not using stock animals, the other way you mitigate that risk is you do every bit of research you possibly can. Your e-scouting is so critical in a backcountry hunt, so it lessens the likelihood that you're going to go in there and it's going to be the Dead Sea, the dry hole, the place that has no elk. So what are the pros and cons of each? Well, the pros of a backcountry camp is they're just cool. They're going to take you to some cool places. There's probably places that you're like, someday I want to go way back in that drainage 10 miles back there. That's the chance to do it. Usually, not always, but usually you're going to have a lot more solitude, which means far less hunting pressure. Those are all good things. Usually the tags in these areas that are real backcountry experiences or that require backcountry camps to hunt effectively, those tags are usually easier to draw. Because the hunting pressure is lower, you're usually going to have higher success rates and you're going to have an older age class of animals. Not always, but usually. And unlike a base camp, you aren't going to spend a lot of time every morning hiking in 3 miles, 4 miles, hiking out every evening 3 or 4 miles, because you're going to be within probably a mile or so of where you're going to do most of your hunting. So here are the cons. I kind of touched on it, right? It's the risk part of it. If you have company, if another group comes in there or another group beat you in there, your plans are going to go south in a hurry. Now, if you fill a tag, and we're talking a big elk, right? And you're 6 miles back in there, you're not doing it in one load unless you have stock animals. It's a lot of work. And kind of a corollary to that is if you're doing it in warmer weather, which is when we do most of our backcountry camps, the risk of meat spoilage in that warm weather when you're that far back and got to make that many trips, that increases the likelihood of meat spoilage. And if there are 2 or 3 of you and you plan on shooting more than one elk, whew, that can be pretty intimidating to think about. So, when do we use backcountry camps? We use them when we need to put distance and topography as our allies to reduce hunting pressure. So you'll see us go way back in there in places where we know, hey, out on the front country, there's a lot of hunting pressure. We use them when we have access to llamas, or some people it could be horses or goats or whatever, because one, it mitigates our risk by making us more mobile, more flexible, and we can handle more than one elk if we need to. And we probably use backcountry camps in the more milder periods of the year. We're talking September, maybe October. Yeah, I'd say through October in the Rockies, we usually can get by with it. So that's kind of the idea on backcountry camps. Base camps are way lower risk. Maybe not as much reward, but they provide a lot more flexibility and a lot more mobility. We usually pick a campsite that's going to give us access to multiple trailheads or multiple spots we'll hike into. And that provides some flexibility in the event our favorite spot is somehow inundated with hunting pressure. Or maybe our favorite spot or our first choice spot just doesn't have any animals, right? Our e-scouting, we did all this. We get there and all of a sudden the blizzard comes and this spot really isn't where the elk are. They got pushed out in the last 3 days because of weather. So I could give you all kinds of examples of why a base camp gives you way more flexibility. And usually how we do it is we set up a base camp and we might be driving 8 miles to a trailhead over this way and then hike in for 2 miles to Glass. Or maybe we go 5 miles to a trailhead over this way and we hike in for a mile, 2, 3 miles to Glass. So that's what I'm talking about when it gives you options and gives you flexibility. So the pros of a base camp, more options, more flexibility, as I just discussed. I can hunt multiple spots, multiple parts of a transition range from one camp. And as I get older and it's November and December, I like the creature comforts that come with a more comfortable camp. It allows me to hunt harder when I am hunting because it's less time invested in filtering water and all the other things that go into it. And I get more rest. I'm probably going to eat better. I'm going to hunt harder. So when do we use base camps? Just about always in the post-rut in the late season. Those elk hunts, we know that it's probably going to be foul weather. We know that the elk are moving down their transition range from the summer range to the winter range, or somewhere in that transition range. But they're moving based on what the weather patterns are. And we got to have the mobility to be able to get in front of those elk. If we just stake our plan way up here high on the transition range and the elk are already down, we're wasting a lot of our hunt. So when we need flexibility and mobility to locate and stay with where the elk are at, definitely going to be a base camp situation. You know, the type of camp you choose is also going to be heavily influenced by your hunting style and just your personal preference. But when you think about it, take into account these risk-reward issues and think about what the elk patterns will be during the calendar period that you're going to be hunting them. And I think you're going to make the right decision. Good luck.